Welcome to another G News update. Well, if you are Nicola Willis, you had a really bad time during the period immediately after the budget because it was one of the worst budgets New Zealand has seen for many, many years. And I think the way that Nicola Willis and David Seymour and Brooke Van Velden reached in and stole all of that $12.8 billion of contingency money set aside for pay equity for low-income women, something like 180,000 people, mostly women, had their hope and dreams for the future that they might be able to make ends meet and pay for things like butter and groceries, that kind of stuff more easily with a little bit left over, completely dashed by Nicola Willis, who's pretty well off, pretty well sorted and just punching down. And really what we're seeing here is a pattern of the government at the moment robbing the poor and transferring the wealth to their voting constituencies, which include the rural sector, farmers particularly, and property owners, property investors, and some of the higher wealth individuals who are employers. We're seeing all of them getting all of the wealth and all of the advantages, while the people in most need, obviously, all around the country, are actually having things made much harder for them in the middle of a cost of living crisis that Christopher Luxon promised was actually going to be resolved by now, and was things were going to get done, and you could trust National to get things done and to bring you tax relief that would be meaningful. But right now, all of that's been swallowed up by all these rates increases. The prices of food and vegetables has skyrocketed. And that's all we're talking about this morning. The first thing Vicky talked to me about was the price of butter. I mean, my goodness, hasn't it gone up? We'll get to that in a minute. But look, first of all, we've got this desperation, and we've got desperation for votes, and the National Party are going out there right now using every string they can pull in the media to kind of make up for the fact that they've really blundered. They've made a lot of short-term decisions that have had bad impacts that were probably intended, but they might say there were unintended consequences that they're now in denial about. One of those is illustrated by this picture. This is the ferry, and these ferries are not working. They're breaking down all the time, and people are being held up for hours and hours. And this reminds everyone that shortly after Nicola Willis came to power, she sent a text off to South Korea, and no phone call, just a text with about an hour's notice to say, hey, look, we're just cancelling this entire build us some ferries deal that we made with you, and we'll just soak up these hundreds of millions of dollars worth of costs, and we'll delay the provision of those services to New Zealanders, and we'll just put up with broken down ferries. And I have delivered. These days, if you talk to Nicola Willis about this, she'll push you away and say, hey, that's not my area. I have delivered. But what did she deliver? She delivered broken down ferries, worse services, and this affects production. It's kind of like our state highway, number one, across the two islands. And Nicola Willis had no worries about disrupting all of that and delaying that. Winston Peters has allocated $4 billion to replace the ferries, at the same time as lashing out at the previous government, who never spent that much money, but Treasury forecast that possibly it could have risen that far. So these kind of things aren't made very clear in the papers. They're not headlines, are they? They're usually some sort of small little part at the very bottom in the fine print. But so given that circumstance, and given that budget, and given the way that things economically are bad, growth is gone, Nicola Willis has been looking for some kind of good news story, this week in particular, to the constituency in agriculture. As you know, it's field days at the moment, and so all of the National Party have rushed to their friends in the farming sector to assure them about all the things they've done, like rejecting climate change and keeping agriculture out of the ETS, while scientists all over the world say, hey, come on, let's do something about methane. Here's a picture of Christopher Luxon sitting at field days with the climate minister, Simon Watts, and good old Trade Macleay. And these guys are sitting in the science tent that's been set up to show them that in the future, possibly, maybe, you don't know, but there could be some biofeed and vaccines that might just reduce the methane that come from our cows. So they're clinging to the hope about technology will save us at the moment from our methane targets, and none of it's proven, but they're going to gamble on it because things are desperate right now. At the same time, we've seen the prices of milk go up all around the world, and we've seen a lot of talk about how this is actually a global problem, and it's not to do with people back home making massive profits and farmers cashing in and doing well. They'll tell you at the same time that they've got other issues which are climate related, like more and more droughts. And this comes from years and years of ignoring climate change scientists, which Christopher Luxon is continuing to do. I thought what we'd just start by doing is looking at this headline from Nicola Willis, given that opening about the desperation involved for votes. And here she is talking about how great it is that there's been basically an order across Kāinga Ora and other 130 other agencies that they've got to use wool. So this is to please the voting constituency for the National Party, that sheep farmers basically, and how their wool will be used in Kāinga Ora new builds. But if you go back to January, you can find this headline, and this headline says, hey, look, we're going to use wool in all the Kāinga Ora state houses from now on. So why today are we repeating that headline at Radio New Zealand? And what does this tell us about the way in which you can buy headlines if you're the National Party from New Zealand media? You can get re-announcements of old announcements during the week when you need them if you're desperate enough. That's kind of what it looks like, doesn't it? We're re-announcing the same news from January today in June for field days. So there's that. And then we've got, let's go back to the butter prices. And as I mentioned, Vicky was talking about the ridiculous price of butter. Here's what's going on. Well, butter's actually sometimes costing over $12 now a block. And statistics will tell you that the price of butter's gone up about 65% in the last year under a Nicola Willis government. During the COVID period and during the year leading up to the 2023 election, Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon relentlessly blamed domestic conditions and ignored imported inflation, global conditions, all the other countries around the world who had high inflation. And they said, this has nothing to do with any of that. This is not global. This is actually all to do with Grant Robertson and his spending. And a lot of people, particularly people working in groundswell protest movements, believed everything that they were told because they were quite resentful and they wanted to find any kind of excuse to exhibit their kind of madness, really, trying to take it out on the government. Christopher Luxon fed all this, and so did Nicola Willis. They were proven on Q&A to be talking rubbish about inflation many times. But government spending became the villain, and this all led to austerity we see today and all these wealth transfers from the most needy, like all of those women who are hoping to get pay equity in their low-income jobs, who are undervalued, and the sex-based discrimination continues. As we see this kind of thing happening here with farmers rejoicing at the way that they can write off 20% of their new assets, their new tractors, their new farm equipment, and this is going to make us more productive in some way, but it's not going to trickle down. It's just going to trickle down in higher prices. Even over in Australia, here's a headline from Australia about butter. It's costing people in Australia less to buy New Zealand butter than it costs New Zealanders to buy butter. Wow. So here's some commentary from the Breakfast TV show this morning with Ginny Anderson really on fire and making Paul Goldsmith look like a twittering fool. Here it is. Go, Ginny.
The cost of butter. What are you paying for butter at the moment at the supermarket? Ginny, you first?
$8.50 on
Right,
special.
so you're finding the deal, and Paul?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's better. I see that Pack and Save are celebrating their 40 years. You never know. Sometimes it can be a bit cheaper around. I've seen it for $7.50, but it keeps on going up at the moment.
We'll
so
get a
it's
couple
pretty
of
bad.
$8 for a scone. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Why is it so expensive?
Well, as you
Cost
can
of
see.
living crisis. This government have failed under cost of living. If butter is $8.50 and a scone is $8.
I think it's something related to global butter
now
prices.
it's global. And now it's a global problem, is
So
it?
it's a global commodity. But so
It wasn't the
it's
case when we were in government,
It's one
it
of
was
those
us,
one of
yeah.
those things that when the farmers are doing well on that front, it does make it more difficult domestically. Similar with meat, but look, it's a very tough time, and so we're very focused on doing everything we can to help people, New Zealanders, with the cost of living pressures. But butter is expensive at the moment.
You've cut wages. Wages have gone down in terms of pay equity, in terms of workers' wages. So they're not keeping up with inflation and they can't buy butter. It's pretty
We've got
unbelievable.
to make a living.
Jenny also was pretty hot on the trail of how there's a slapdash desperation around tourism marketing. You may have heard earlier in the week that Chris Hipkins mentioned that the National Party slashed $20 million of tourism marketing last year in a blind, foolish rush. And now this year they're going, oh crap, we're going to have to actually reintroduce some spending. So you've seen announcements making up for the way in which they cut tourism marketing last year, and now they want to do some tourism marketing. But tourist operators all over the country are saying, hey, look, hold on a minute. What about the wages for the people that are supposed to support these tourists that come to these small towns? And what about infrastructure to give them a place to stay, places to go? We're not able to cope if you're going to just do this in an unplanned, rush, short-term, desperate, clinging for votes kind of way. Well, here is the segment on TVNZ Breakfast this morning about that unplanned, terrible, unforeseen, but probably intended consequences of what short-term and bad planning does when it comes to tourism.
Out into the regions for the tourism.
Well, we want to make sure if we're investing $13 million in advertising that those parts of New Zealand that need more economy injection get it. And there's nothing in this plan to show where we're leading tourists to, and there's nothing there to attract people to work and stay in those areas. And those regions are crying out right now during a cost of living crisis.
How are we helping the regions, Minister?
Oh, there's lots going on. I'm Minister for Arts and Heritage, and there's huge opportunity in those small places. You go to Whanganui, for example, the Sargent Gallery. There's a trail that's been developing down the west coast through Hokitika, and there's all sorts of work being done in our regions because it's the most beautiful parts of our country. And so we've got opportunities there.
Arts and
You've
culture
got
is
to
going
build
to
on
be
it.
stimulating the economy.
In terms of the tourism.
Once again, Ginny looking like she's dominating the crap out of Paul Goldsmith. And this was also the case when it came to the topic around strengthening stalker laws. Ginny Anderson has actually personally made it one of her missions to actually improve and strengthen safety for women in New Zealand by extending the dates and number of times that stalking incidents are taken into account in the new law. And National, lazy old National, who really don't care, actually thought, oh, well, that's a good idea. Thanks, Labor. We'll, do that. We'll take credit for that. So good on Ginny for kind of pointing out where the credit really is due.
The number of incidents and extending the time frame in which these can occur in terms of actually penalising people for these stalking offences?
Yes, I pushed hard for that change at Select Committee, and I'm really pleased that the government listened to the concerns that I raised at that committee stage. Let's remember when we first talked about stalking legislation, Paul said it wasn't a priority. I introduced a member's bill and the government has moved at pace, and I've got to say good on them for doing that.
In other topics, you've got the same kind of thing happening in health, and you've got a headline today with Simeon Brown claiming that National are fantastic because they're privatising. As you know, Simeon Brown's main medical qualification is that he was a bank teller, and he's been ruthlessly trying to privatise health, and this has resulted in headlines and boasting around reducing the number of people that are waiting for surgery by making them go, the easy ones anyway, go over to the private sector where they can take up some of those operations, thank you very much, for a big fat taxpayer subsidy. funded by low-income women and all those people who had their pay equity stolen. So, can transfer and reprioritise this money around to suit National's voting constituency. However, as per the unintended consequences which are denied, 1 month ago, Simeon Brown was caught out trying to redact the fact that there were massive risks in his ruthless privatisation and short-term desperation to present some sort of voting story around targets and how they'd done 10,000 or 20,000 operations using the private sector. So here's the headline there. So Simeon Brown had redacted, hidden and concealed the risks, of which there were 4 main areas to the health system. I won't go through them all now, but basically they come down to things like disrupting the flow for operations within the public sector, making more and more doctors leave the profession, extending the amount of time that it takes for doctors and surgeons to be trained, because the surgeries that they need to do need to add up to a certain number of surgeries, and by taking away those surgeries and giving them to the private sector, it's going to take years and years longer for someone to train as a doctor, and therefore not many more people will do it. They'll go to other countries to do it. So thank you, National, thank you, Simeon Brown, boasting about your short-term unintended consequences that you try and cover it up. Now that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing from Christopher Luxon's government, Nicola Willis. We've got the ferries, what a debacle. We've got the health system, what a debacle. We've got the people denying climate science and clinging on to tech that isn't really there yet in agriculture. You've got this kind of ridiculous price for a pound of butter, 500 grams of butter, and all of the other things that people need to kind of live and survive in New Zealand. But this government doesn't care. It doesn't give a shit about it. They've defunded the Predator 2050 efforts as well, so that all of our indigenous species are put under threat from rats and stoats and weasels and wild cats. So, they don't care about the ordinary people. They don't care about the vast majority of voters. This government cares only about its constituents. It wants to win. It's short-term in its thinking. It creates problems, unintended consequences that it then denies and doesn't want to talk about. Look at homelessness. They are so proud of their waiting list, but when they're asked about that and held to account about it, they go, I'm very proud of our waiting list. But what about homelessness? I'm very proud of our waiting lists. But what about homelessness? It's exploding in Auckland, in Christchurch, in Wellington. Look at the numbers, look at the facts, look at all the providers crying out to you about homelessness. These are people on the street. Come and talk to them. Oh, but look at our waiting list. And you see they just keep diverting. They're in denial. These consequences are the consequences of the way in which they play for votes, and they do not care about you. They do not care about your community. They don't care really about this country. So come on, New Zealand, vote this lot out. They do not care about you. They're acting against your best interests. We can have a much, much better New Zealand. Aotearoa New Zealand, vote this lot out, and I'll talk to you again soon.